Seoul was a city of ghosts at 3:00 a.m., but inside the penthouse of the Lot World Tower, the air was screaming. Park Seung-Jin, a man who had spent 15 years making the bravest men in the underworld weep for mercy, was currently losing a war against a wooden door. He sat in a designer chair he hadn't touched in 3 years, his tailored black suit rumpled, his white shirt open to reveal the black ink of the tiger tattoo crawling up his chest. His medium-length black hair was a mess, ruined by the frantic run of his fingers through it over the last 4 hours. He looked like a man possessed. He looked like a man who had finally realized that the ice palace he built to protect his heart was actually a tomb. For 3 years, he had treated Amara Sinclair like she didn't exist. He had walked past her in the halls, eaten dinners in a cathedral of silence, and convinced himself that if he didn't look at her, the Elder Council couldn't use her against him. He thought he was protecting her. He was actually just burying her alive. Then the lock clicked. The door swung open and the ghost walked in, but she wasn't a ghost anymore. Amara stepped into the foyer, her deep brown skin glowing under the recessed amber lights. She was wearing a form-fitting red evening dress that didn't just command attention, it demanded a surrender. Her voluminous natural afro framed her face like a crown, and she held her heels in one hand with a casual, devastating grace. She didn't startle when she saw him. She didn't flinch at the explosive rage radiating off his lean, powerful build. She simply looked at him with calm confidence and slight amusement, as if he were a piece of furniture he'd moved into the wrong corner. "You're late," Seung-Jin roared, his voice cracking the silence of 3 years. "Where have you been?" Amara didn't answer. She didn't even stop walking. She simply hummed a low, soulful melody, adjusted her diamond bracelet, and walked right past the most dangerous man in Seoul like he was made of glass. The fixer was broken, and the woman he ignored was finally holding the hammer. Subscribe to this channel as we continue with this story. The penthouse didn't feel like a home. It felt like a museum dedicated to the art of being alone together. Park Seung-Jin had designed it that way, a sprawling sanctuary of gray marble and reinforced glass, where the silence was so heavy it felt structural. For 3 years, this was the Ice Palace Protocol, a cold, clinical existence where they moved like 2 satellites in the same orbit, close enough to see the light reflecting off one another but never close enough to touch. Seung-Jin had convinced himself that silence was a mercy. In the violent, jagged world of the Korean syndicate, emotion was a leak in the hull of a ship. If he didn't look at Amara, if he didn't speak her name, if he treated her like a beautiful, static piece of the architecture, then his enemies couldn't find the thread that connected his heart to his throat. He had made her a ghost to keep her from becoming a target. He would leave the penthouse before the sun hit the Han River, his footsteps echoing against the polished floors, never offering a goodbye or a see you tonight. He would return long after the city had gone quiet, find her sleeping or reading in the far wing of the apartment, and simply nod to the shadow she cast on the wall. He was a man who commanded legions with a whisper, yet he had spent 1,000 days refusing to say a single word to the woman who shared his bed. But while Seung-Jin was using the silence as a shield, Amara Sinclair was using it as a whetstone. She had arrived in Seoul 3 years ago as a striking anomaly, a brilliant, deep-skinned woman with a laugh that could cut through the gloom of a boardroom. But when the silence began, she didn't wither. She didn't beg for the scraps of his attention or cry behind the locked doors of the guest suite. Instead, she adapted. If Seung-Jin wanted a ghost, she would become a poltergeist, invisible but capable of moving the very foundations of his world without him ever seeing her hand. The penthouse, which Seung-Jin viewed as a secure fortress, became Amara's workshop. While he was out in the rain-slicked alleys of Gangnam or the high-rise offices of the Elder Council, Amara was dissecting the life he thought he was keeping from her. She learned the rhythm of his security details by the sound of their boots on the gravel. She learned the state of his empire by the tension in his shoulders when he stood by the window at midnight. She began to treat her isolation as a scholarship. She mastered the language, then the subtext of the city, and finally, the digital footprints of the men who called themselves Seung-Jin's brothers. She spent her afternoons in the Ice Palace, not as a lonely wife, but as an architect of information. She sat at the marble kitchen island, her voluminous afro a crown of defiance against the sterile minimalist decor, sipping tea and mapping out the financial arteries of the syndicate. She discovered the leaks he hadn't found. She saw the way the elder council looked at Seung-Jin, not as a leader, but as a weapon that was becoming too sharp to handle safely. She saw the retirement plan they were drafting in the dark, long before Seung-Jin even sensed the betrayal. The protocol was supposed to keep her safe and small, but it had backfired spectacularly. By ignoring her, Seung-Jin had given her the greatest gift a spy could ever ask for: total invisibility. He never checked her laptop. He never questioned her whereabouts. He never wondered why the ghost was suddenly spending so much time at the city's most exclusive jazz lounges, or why she had opened 7 different shell companies under her maiden name. He was so busy being the fixer for everyone else that he failed to notice his wife was fixing the very board he was playing on. The 3-year winter had been a test of endurance. Seung-Jin had endured it by hardening his heart until it was a diamond, beautiful, cold, and incapable of feeling. Amara had endured it by turning her heart into a furnace, fueling a quiet, burning ambition to never be the victim of his world. She watched him from the shadows of their own home, her deep brown eyes tracing the line of his jaw, knowing that one day the ice would have to break. She knew that the man who treated her like she didn't exist would eventually have to face the fact that she was the only reason he was still breathing. And so the silence stretched, year after year, a long, frozen corridor with no doors. Seung-Jin thought he was winning because the apartment was quiet. He thought the Ice Palace was holding. He didn't realize that under the frozen surface, the current was moving faster than he could ever run. He didn't realize that every time he walked past her without a word, he was adding another brick to the fortress she was building. A fortress that wouldn't just protect her, but would eventually house the ruins of his pride. The winter was long, but it wasn't infinite. And at 3:00 a.m., the first crack finally appeared. The silence of the penthouse was usually a heavy, predictable thing, but tonight it felt sharpened, like a blade resting against Park Seung-Jin's throat. He sat in the darkness of the living room, a space he usually treated as a transit point between his car and his bed, watching the digital glow of the oven clock in the open-concept kitchen. 2:58 a.m., then 2:59. At exactly 3:00 a.m., the heavy mahogany door groaned on its hinges, and the 3-year winter suffered its first catastrophic crack. Amara didn't sneak in. She didn't fumble with her keys or look over her shoulder like a woman guilty of a secret. She stepped into the foyer with the steady, rhythmic stride of someone who owned the air she breathed. The first thing that hit Seung-Jin wasn't the sight of her, but the scent. The sterile, expensive air of the apartment, usually smelling of nothing but filtered oxygen and cold stone, was suddenly invaded by the rich, unapologetic musk of high-end Cuban tobacco and the velvet sting of aged cognac. It was a masculine scent, a scent of power and dark rooms where decisions were made, and it sat on his wife like a second skin. He felt a roar of possessive fury ignite in his chest, a heat he hadn't allowed himself to feel since the day he decided to stop looking at her. He watched from the shadows as she kicked off her heels, the red silk of her dress shimmering like a low-burning fire in the dim light. She didn't look toward his corner. She didn't check to see if his bedroom door was closed. She moved with a devastating, casual indifference that made his 3 years of calculated neglect look like a child's game. "Where were you?" His voice was a low rasp, unused to being projected within these walls. It was the sound of a predator whose territory had been marked by a stranger. He stood up, his tall, imposing frame unfolding from the chair like a shadow taking shape. His messy hair and open collar gave him a frantic, unhinged edge that contrasted sharply with her absolute composure. Amara stopped, but she didn't turn around. She stood in the center of the marble floor, her back to him, her voluminous natural afro silhouetted against the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the sleeping Seoul skyline. She let out a soft, hummed note, a bluesy, wandering melody that felt like a slap to his face. It was the sound of a woman who was perfectly content in her own company, a woman who had forgotten he was even there. "Amara, look at me." He crossed the distance between them in 3 predatory strides, stopping just inches from her. The scent of the cognac was stronger now, swirling around them, mocking his ice palace protocol. He wanted to grab her shoulders, to shake her until the ghost he had created disappeared and the woman he had married returned. But he didn't touch her. Even in his rage, the habit of distance was a hard ghost to kill. She finally turned slowly, as if she were moving through water. Her deep brown skin was radiant, her makeup flawless despite the hour, and her eyes, those intense, intelligent eyes he had spent years avoiding, met his with a terrifying lack of fear. There was no guilt in her expression. There was no flicker of the weakness he had tried so hard to protect her from. There was only a cool, polished amusement that made him feel small. "You're awake, Seung-Jin," she said, her voice smooth and melodic, carrying no trace of the bitterness he expected. "That's a change. I thought you only lived in the daylight now." "It's 3 in the morning," he hissed, his fists clenching at his sides. "You smell like a club, you smell like a man's lounge. Who were you with?" Amara leaned back slightly, her gaze raking over his disheveled appearance, the rumpled suit, the intense dark eyes radiating a desperate authority. She reached up, not to touch him, but to adjust the diamond bracelet on her wrist, the stones catching the moonlight and throwing jagged sparks across the room. "I was with the world you tried to hide me from," she whispered. The amusement in her voice shifted into something sharper, something more lethal. "And it turns out, Seung-Jin, the world isn't nearly as frightening as a husband who pretends his wife is a shadow." She stepped around him then, her shoulder brushing his chest, a brief, electric contact that sent a jolt through his system. She didn't wait for a rebuttal. She didn't offer an explanation. She simply walked toward her wing of the penthouse, the train of her red dress whispering against the floor like a final warning. Seung-Jin remained standing in the center of the room, the silence rushing back in to fill the space she had occupied. But the silence was different now. It wasn't a shield anymore. It was an indictment. He looked down at his hands and realized they were shaking. He had spent 3 years perfecting the art of ignoring her, convinced that by keeping her in the dark, he was the one in control. But as the scent of cognac and expensive smoke lingered in the air, he realized the truth. He hadn't been keeping her in the dark. He had been leaving her alone in the room where the light was kept, and she had finally figured out how to turn it on. The pattern wasn't just broken, it was shattered. And as he watched the light under her bedroom door disappear, Park Seung-Jin realized for the first time that he was no longer the most dangerous person in the house. The following evening, the silence in the penthouse was no longer a cold vacuum. It was a pressurized chamber. Park Seung-Jin sat in his office, the glow of 4 computer monitors illuminating the sharp, jagged lines of his jaw. He was a man who moved pieces across the city like a grandmaster, yet for the first time in 3 years, he couldn't predict the opening move of the woman in the room down the hall. At 10:00 p.m., the ghost stirred. He heard the rhythmic click of her heels, the sound of her signature red dress being zipped, the faint mist of a perfume that smelled like jasmine and defiance. When the front door finally clicked shut, Seung-Jin didn't wait. He broke the first and most sacred rule of his own Ice Palace protocol. He followed her. He didn't take the armored Mercedes or his usual detail of stone-faced guards. He took a nondescript black motorcycle, weaving through the neon-drenched veins of Seoul with a predatory focus. He kept a 3-car distance, his dark eyes locked on the taillights of the taxi Amara had summoned. He expected to feel the burn of a husband's betrayal. He expected to see her slip into a boutique hotel or a darkened apartment in Apgujeong to meet a man who gave her the warmth he had withheld. He was prepared to break that man. He was prepared to finally have a reason for the rage that was currently drowning his logic. The taxi didn't stop at a hotel. Instead, it pulled up to the curb of an unmarked, velvet-curtained establishment in a quiet corner of Hanamdong. There was no sign, only a brass light illuminating a heavy oak door. It was the Gilded Cage, a private lounge so exclusive that even Seung-Jin's high-ranking lieutenants struggled to get a table. It was the kind of place where the air was thick with the scent of vintage cognac and the weight of secrets that could topple a government. Seung-Jin parked in the shadows, pulling his helmet off and letting his messy black hair fall over his eyes. He watched as Amara stepped out of the car. In the moonlight, her deep brown skin looked like polished obsidian against the crimson of her dress. She didn't look like a woman meeting a lover. She looked like a queen entering her court. She handed a gold card to the doorman without looking at him, and the heavy oak door vanished behind her. He waited 5 minutes before entering. The interior was a symphony of low-light amber and deep blues, the sound of a melancholy saxophone weeping in the corner. He stayed in the darkened periphery of the bar, his tailored suit blending into the shadows. His eyes scanned the room for a man, a rival, a younger face, anyone who looked like they were waiting for her. But Amara wasn't looking for a man. She was seated at a circular booth in the most secluded corner of the lounge. Surrounding her were 3 women, their faces partially obscured by the plumes of thin, expensive cigarettes. Seung-Jin's blood turned to ice as he recognized them. To his left sat Madame Kang, the wife of the council's eldest treasurer. Across from her was the young, porcelain-faced bride of General Choi, the man who controlled the syndicate's shipping routes. And beside Amara, leaning in so close their shoulders touched, was the widow of the former chairman, a woman who held the keys to the council's most private ledgers. This wasn't an affair, this was an insurrection. Seung-Jin watched, paralyzed, as the women spoke in hushed, urgent tones. They weren't gossiping about fashion or the trivialities of high society. He could see the way Madame Kang handed a small, encrypted USB drive across the table, sliding it under a cocktail napkin. He saw the way Amara nodded, her expression focused and clinical, her slight amusement gone, replaced by the terrifyingly sharp gaze of a master tactician. The women weren't just talking to her, they were reporting to her. He realized then that the Whisper Network he had heard rumors of, the silent exchange of information among the wives of the powerful, had found its architect. For 3 years, while he had ignored Amara to protect her from the syndicate, she had been building a syndicate of her own inside the very homes of his enemies. She had realized what he had forgotten, that the men of the Elder Council spoke freely in front of their wives, treating them as part of the furniture, never imagining that the decor was listening, recording, and analyzing. A low, guttural sound escaped his throat, a mix of a laugh and a snarl. He had spent 3 years treating her like a ghost, and in that vacuum of attention, she had become the most dangerous information broker in the city. She wasn't looking for another man's love, she was looking for the council's throat. One of the women laughed at something Amara said, and Amara leaned back, sipping a dark liquid that looked like liquid gold. She looked up then, her eyes sweeping across the room with a practiced indifference. For a split second, her gaze landed on the darkened corner where Seung-Jin stood. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. Her eyes didn't widen. She didn't gasp or look away in guilt. She simply raised her glass a fraction of an inch, a silent, mocking toast to the husband who had finally bothered to show up. Then, she turned back to the council's wives, leaving him standing in the dark, feeling the full weight of his own stupidity. He had followed her to find a rival he could kill. Instead, he had found a partner he didn't deserve. The realization was more painful than any bullet. He saw the women lean in again, their silhouettes merging into a single, formidable shadow. The shadow hunt was over, but the war was just beginning. Seung-Jin realized he wasn't the hunter tonight. He was a man standing on the tracks of a high-speed train, and his wife was the one with her hand on the throttle. He turned and walked out of the lounge, the cool Seoul air hitting his face like a splash of cold water. As he kicked the motorcycle into gear, the roar of the engine felt hollow. The ice palace was melting, and as the water rose, he realized he didn't know how to swim in the world Amara had created. He had ignored her for 3 years, and in that time, she had learned how to dismantle his entire life without ever raising her voice. He drove back to the penthouse, his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't go to his office. He went to the kitchen, poured a glass of whiskey with hands that were finally, terrifyingly steady, and sat in the dark. He didn't watch the door this time. He watched the city, waiting for 3:00 a.m., waiting for the woman in the red dress to come home and tell him just how much he had already lost. The next morning, the ice palace felt as though its foundations were groaning under the weight of the previous night's revelations. Park Seung-Jin did not leave for the docks at dawn, nor did he head to the syndicate's steel and glass headquarters in Gangnam. Instead, he stayed in the penthouse, moving through the silent corridors like a man haunted by a ghost he had finally started to see. He waited until the mid-morning sun hit the Han River, casting long, jagged shadows across the marble floors, and watched as Amara left for her daily errands. Though he now knew that every step she took was a calculated move on a chessboard he hadn't realized existed. Once the elevator chimes faded into the silence, Seung-Jin walked toward her wing of the apartment. For 3 years, this door had been a boundary he respected out of a cold, misplaced sense of duty. Today, he pushed it open, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Her dressing room was a masterclass in elegant misdirection. It smelled of jasmine and the faint, lingering musk of last night's cigar smoke. Rows of designer heels and silk gowns stood like silent sentinels, but as Seung-Jin's dark eyes scanned the space, he looked past the luxury. He began to touch the walls, his fingers tracing the seams of the custom cabinetry with the clinical precision of a man who dealt in secrets. He found it near the back, behind a rack of heavy winter coats he had bought her but never saw her wear. A seam in the wood didn't sit flush. A pressure-sensitive latch clicked under his thumb, and the wall groaned open. Step by step, Seung-Jin entered the room he was never meant to find. It wasn't a dressing room, it was a war room. The space was small, windowless, and chilled by the hum of high-end servers. A single ergonomic chair sat before a curved monitor that took up an entire wall. There were no photos of them, no mementos of a marriage that never truly began. Instead, the walls were covered in digital tablets and physical whiteboards, pinned with organizational charts of the Elder Council. Lines of red ink connected names he had trusted since he was a boy to offshore bank accounts he had never seen. Seung-Jin felt the air leave his lungs as he sat in the chair, the leather still holding a faint warmth. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he touched the keyboard. The screen flickered to life, requiring no password for a husband who had finally bothered to look. The file was titled The Ledger of Sins. He scrolled through the data, and the world he had spent 15 years building began to dissolve into ash. It wasn't just a list of transactions. It was an autopsy of his own empire. Amara had been tracking the Elder Council's financial movements with a level of forensic detail that surpassed his own accountants. He saw the skimming, first, small, untraceable percentages taken from the shipping routes, the construction bids, and the nightlife protection fees. Over 3 years, those fractions had snowballed into a staggering $50 million. But the betrayal went deeper than simple theft. He found a subfolder labeled the Retirement Protocol. Inside were encrypted transcripts of meetings between the council elders. They spoke of Seung-Jin as a rabid dog that had served its purpose. They discussed his weakness, his marriage to Amara, as the perfect leverage point. They planned to frame him for a massive tax evasion scandal, using the very money they had stolen from him to pave the way for his replacement. Seung-Jin stared at the screen, his jaw tightening until it ached. He had thought he was protecting Amara by ignoring her, but she had been the one standing in the breach. While he was playing the part of the terrifying mafia boss, she was the one holding the line against the men who wanted him dead. She hadn't been coming home at 3:00 a.m. because she was bored or unfaithful. She was coming home because she was fighting a war on his behalf, a war he was too blind to see. The ledger was a map of every bribe, every secret mistress, and every hidden asset the council owned. It was enough evidence to burn the entire syndicate to the ground. He realized then that Amara wasn't just an information broker, she was an executioner. She was waiting for the right moment to pull the trigger, and she had been doing it all from within the ice palace he had built to keep her silent. A sudden sound from the bedroom made him freeze. The front door had opened. The rhythmic, confident click of heels on marble echoed through the penthouse. Amara was home early. Seung-Jin didn't close the hidden door. He didn't hide. He stood up, his tall frame casting a long shadow over the digital evidence of his own failure. He waited in the mouth of the secret room as the footsteps grew closer. When Amara stepped into the dressing room, she didn't look surprised to find the wall open. She didn't look afraid. She stopped, her deep brown skin highlighted by the soft glow of the server lights, and looked at him with that same slight amusement that was beginning to feel like a death sentence. "You're in my office, Seung-Jin," she said quietly, her voice echoing in the small space. She wasn't wearing red today. She was in a sharp, charcoal gray suit that looked like armor. "I was wondering how long it would take for the fixer to finally fix his own house." "They're going to kill me," Seung-Jin said, his voice a low, jagged rasp. He gestured to the screen to the retirement protocol. "And they were going to use you to do it." Amara walked toward him, stepping into the war room until she was close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her eyes. She reached out, her fingers grazing the lapel of his suit, the first time she had touched him in years. "No, Seung-Jin," she whispered. "They were going to use me, until I decided to use them instead." She looked at the monitor, her expression turning cold and clinical. "You wanted a ghost, so I gave you one. But ghosts have a way of seeing things the living miss. I've already moved the 50 million. I've already notified the internal auditors. The only thing left to decide is if you're going to stay in this room and watch the world burn, or if you're going to step outside and help me lead the survivors." The silence that followed was different from the 3-year winter. It was the silence before a storm, a heavy, electric tension that promised a total transformation. Seung-Jin looked from the ledger to the woman standing before him, and for the first time in his life, he felt a flicker of genuine fear. Not of his enemies or the council or the death they had planned for him. He was afraid of the woman he had married, and in that fear he found the first spark of a love he had spent 3 years trying to kill. He realized that the ice palace hadn't just melted, it had been repurposed into a fortress. And as he looked at the ledger of sins, he knew that the nightmare didn't just travel in pairs, it was currently standing in a dressing room in Seoul, ready to take over the world. The tension in the war room was no longer cold, it was combustible. Park Seung-Jin stood amidst the glowing monitors and the digital blueprints of his own downfall, his silhouette jagged against the light of the servers. He felt like a man who had woken up to find that the floor of his home was actually the ceiling of a much deeper, more dangerous abyss. Amara stood in the doorway, her charcoal gray suit sharp enough to bleed, her gaze steady and terrifyingly calm. "Why are you doing this?" The question tore from Seung-Jin's throat, raw and stripped of his usual mafia boss composure. He stepped out of the hidden room, moving into the soft, filtered light of the dressing room, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles were white. "The Elder Council. These men are vipers. They have held the blades to the throats of everyone I've ever cared about. You are playing with fire, Amara. You are dancing on a thread over a pit of wolves." Amara didn't flinch. She didn't move away as he closed the distance between them, his presence imposing and heavy with the scent of adrenaline and desperation. She reached up and slowly unclipped a diamond earring, placing it on the vanity with a click that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. "You think I'm playing, Seung-Jin?" she asked, her voice a low, melodic vibration that carried more weight than his shout. She finally turned to face him fully, her deep brown skin luminous, her expression one of weary brilliance. "You spent 3 years treating me like a porcelain doll you could hide in a cupboard so the dust wouldn't settle on me. You thought that by giving me silence, you were giving me safety. But silence isn't a shield. It's a vacuum. And I decided a long time ago that if I was going to live in a vacuum, I was going to fill it with something useful. You've stolen $50 million from the council's private reserves, Seung-Jin hissed, stepping into her personal space, his shadow engulfing her. Do you have any idea what they do to people who touch their money? They don't just kill you, they erase you. They erase everyone you've ever spoken to. You've put a target on your back that can be seen from space. I didn't just touch their money, Seung-Jin. I relocated it, she corrected him, her eyes flashing with a sudden, predatory heat. And I didn't do it to buy shoes or more red dresses. I did it because money is the only language the elders speak, and I wanted to make sure they went hoarse. She moved past him back into the secret room, her fingers flying across the keyboard. The main monitor shifted from the financial ledgers to a live map of the city. Dozens of glowing red dots pulsed across the grid of Seoul. You say I'm playing with fire, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that chilled him to his marrow. But look at the screen, Seung-Jin. I'm not playing. I've already poured the gasoline. Those red dots, those are the council's primary distribution hubs. Every gram of product, every ledger of black market debt, every illegal shipment arriving at Incheon tonight. I have the digital keys to every single one of their locks. Seung-Jin stared at the map, the scale of her ambition finally beginning to settle in his mind. He had spent his life thinking in terms of muscle and loyalty, of bullets and blood. Amara was thinking in terms of systems and extinction. She hadn't just built a whisper network, she had built a guillotine. They have a hit out on you, he said, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. The retirement protocol. It isn't just about framing me. It's about clearing the board. They're coming tonight, Amara. They're coming to this penthouse to finish what they started 3 years ago. I know, she said, turning back to him. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like a general waiting for the first wave of a battle she had already simulated 1,000 times. I've known since the moment I walked into the gilded cage 6 months ago. Why do you think I started coming home at 3 in the morning? I wasn't out partying. I was meeting the technicians who were bypassing your security filters. I was meeting the wives who were tired of watching their husbands bleed you dry. She walked up to him, her hand coming up to rest on his chest, right over his hammering heart. The contact was electric, a bridge across the 3-year chasm. You tried to save me by ignoring me, and all you did was leave me defenseless. So I saved myself. And in the process, I saved the only man stupid enough to think he could keep a tiger in a glass cage without it eventually learning how to break the glass. Seung-Jin looked down at her hand, then up at her face. The ice palace was gone. The silence was dead. In its place was a raw, terrifying intimacy. He realized that for 3 years he had been mourning a woman who was actually becoming a goddess of the very underworld he thought he ruled. What do we do? He asked. It was the first time in his life he had ever asked anyone for direction. Amara's lips curved into a small, lethal smile, the first genuine smile he had seen in years. It wasn't the smile of the wife he had married. It was the smile of the partner he had finally earned. We stop pretending the house isn't on fire, she said, her eyes burning with a dark, triumphant light. We let it burn, Seung-Jin, and then we see who's left standing in the ashes. The elders are coming to retire a ghost and a fixer. They aren't prepared for what's actually waiting for them in the dark. She reached behind her, pulling a small, sleek black device from the desk and handing it to him. It was a localized jammer, pre-programmed with his own security frequencies. They'll be here in 2 hours, she said, her voice steady as a heartbeat. They think they've cut the power and the exits. They think they've trapped us, but they forgot one thing. What's that? Seung-Jin asked, his fingers closing around the device, his own lethal instincts finally snapping into alignment with hers. They forgot that I'm the one who designed the trap, she whispered. The confrontation was over, but the air in the penthouse remained charged, heavy with the scent of impending violence and a strange, new devotion. Seung-Jin looked at the woman he had spent 3 years pretending didn't exist and realized that he would burn the entire city to the ground just to see her smile like that again. The fixer was gone. The husband was back. And together, they were about to become the council's worst nightmare. The digital clock on the kitchen wall flickered to 1:00 a.m., the pale blue numbers bleeding into the dim light of the penthouse like a countdown. Park Seung-Jin stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection ghosted against the backdrop of a soul that looked indifferent to the storm brewing in his living room. He could feel the weight of the jammer in his pocket, a cold piece of plastic that represented the only shield he had left. Behind him, the hum of the servers in Amara's secret room had ceased, replaced by a silence that felt heavy with the scent of ozone and impending rain. Amara emerged from the dressing room, her movements fluid and devoid of the ghostly hesitation that had defined her for 3 years. She had changed out of her charcoal suit into a tactical jumpsuit of midnight black, though she still wore the diamond bracelet, a sparkling reminder of the world she was about to burn down. She held a tablet in one hand, her thumb hovering over a final command. "They aren't coming to talk, Seung-Jin," she said, her voice cutting through the stillness with the precision of a scalpel. "And they aren't coming to arrest us. The council realized 48 hours ago that their offshore accounts were hemorrhaging. They traced the digital handshake back to this IP address. They don't know it was me specifically, but they know someone in this house has seen their retirement protocol. In their world, a witness is just a corpse that hasn't stopped breathing yet." Seung-Jin turned, his intense dark eyes locking onto hers. The rage that had fueled him for the last few hours had transformed into a cold, lethal clarity. "How long?" "60 minutes, Amara replied. She tapped the screen and a grainy, high-angle feed appeared. It showed the basement garage of their building. 3 black SUVs had just pulled into the VIP bay, vehicles that didn't belong to their security detail. "That's the cleanup crew. They've already paid off the night captain. The elevators will be locked down in 10 minutes and the external comms will go dark 5 minutes after that. They want to make this a quiet domestic tragedy. A high-profile murder-suicide to explain why the fixer and his wife suddenly vanished from the board." Seung-Jin felt a surge of adrenaline that made his pulse thrum in his ears. He was used to being the hunter, the one who orchestrated the disappearance of enemies in the dead of night. To be the prey was a novel sensation, one that tasted like copper and old blood. He looked at the woman who had lived under his roof as a stranger and realized she was the only reason they had even 60 minutes of warning. "You've known they were coming for 2 days, he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Why didn't you tell me? Why wait until the clock is at the final hour?" Amara stepped closer, the light from the tablet illuminating the sharp, confident planes of her face. "Because for 3 years. You told me through your silence that I wasn't part of your world. I needed to know if you were still the man I married or if you had become just another one of the council's tools. If I had told you 48 hours ago, you would have tried to ship me off to a safe house in Jeju and fought this alone. You would have died, Seung-Jin, because you're still fighting with bullets and they're fighting with algorithms." She reached out, her fingers grazing the scar on his jawline, a mark from a knife fight he'd had before they met. "I waited until now because at 60 minutes, there's no time left for you to hide me. Now the only way out is through, together." The weight of her words settled into the marrow of his bones. He had spent years trying to keep her clean from his sins, never realizing that her hands were already stained with the ink of the same ledgers he guarded. He reached up, covering her hand with his own, his thumb tracing the back of her knuckles. The touch was no longer tentative, it was a pact. "They'll come through the service entrance and the balcony simultaneously," Seung-Jin said, his tactical mind finally syncing with hers. "The council always uses a pincer movement for cleanups. They'll have thermal imaging and suppressors." "Let them," Amara whispered, a dark, triumphant spark igniting in her eyes. "They think they've cut the power to the penthouse, but I've rerouted the building's backup generator to my own internal grid. When they step through those doors, they won't find a dark apartment. They're going to find a labyrinth. She walked to the kitchen island and picked up two sleek, compact handguns she had hidden beneath the marble lip of the counter. She handed one to him, grip first. I've spent 3 years mapping the blind spots of your security cameras, Seung-Jin. I know exactly where a man can stand in this room and be invisible. I've turned our home into a kill zone, and I'm the only one with the map. Seung-Jin took the weapon. The familiar weight of the steel ground him. He checked the magazine with a practiced flick of his wrist. 60 minutes, he murmured, looking at the clock. It was 1:04 a.m. What's the end game, Amara? Even if we survive the hit, the council still has the police, the banks, and the streets. The endgame is already in motion, she said, leaning against the counter, her posture remarkably relaxed for a woman facing an assassination squad. The moment the first shot is fired in this penthouse, an automated burst transmission will go out to every major news outlet in Seoul and the Blue House. It contains the full ledger of sins. By dawn, the Elder Council won't be looking for us. They'll be looking for lawyers and exit visas. We aren't just surviving tonight, Seung-Jin. We're inheriting. She looked at him then, her slight amusement replaced by an expression of raw, unadulterated power. I didn't pour the gasoline just to watch a fire. I did it to clear the land for something new. Seung-Jin felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He had spent 15 years fearing the elders, fearing the shadows, fearing his own heart. In the span of an hour, this woman had dismantled his fears and replaced them with a vision of a throne built from the wreckage of his old life. He realized then that the ice palace hadn't just been a cage for her. It had been her cocoon. And the creature that had emerged was something the Seoul underworld was entirely unprepared for. 55 minutes, Seung-Jin said, his voice steady, a lethal calm settling over him. He reached out and pulled her into him, his arm wrapping around her waist, drawing her close until their foreheads touched. The 3 years of silence evaporated in the heat of their shared breath. Let them come. I want to see the looks on their faces when they realize they didn't bring enough men. Amara smiled, a slow, predatory curve of her lips that made his blood sing. They never do, Seung-Jin. They always underestimate the ghost. She pulled away, moving toward the master bedroom to activate the final defensive protocols. Seung-Jin watched her go, his eyes tracing the confident sway of her shoulders. He checked his watch one last time. The countdown was no longer a threat. It was an invitation. He walked to the center of the living room, stood in the shadows where the moonlight didn't reach, and waited for the sound of the first broken lock. The 3-year winter was over. The night of the long knives had begun, and for the first time in his life, Park Seung-Jin wasn't fighting for the syndicate. He was fighting for the queen of the ruins. The transition from silence to violence happened not with a bang, but with a rhythmic, mechanical sigh. At exactly 2:00 a.m., the hum of the penthouse's climate control died. The soft, ambient glow of the floor lamps flickered once and vanished, plunging the glass-walled sanctuary into a tomb-like darkness. Outside, the sprawling neon grid of Seoul remained indifferent, but inside, the air turned electric with the scent of ozone and the heavy, metallic promise of a slaughter. Park Seung-Jin moved through the dark with the fluid, sightless grace of a man who had spent his life in the shadows of the underworld. He didn't need light to find his weapon. His hand found the cold steel of the handgun Amara had given him with the instinct of a soldier returning to a familiar lover. He stepped into the center of the living room, his tall, imposing frame shielding the door to the master suite. His messy black hair fell over eyes that had turned into chips of obsidian. In his mind, the 3 years of neglect had been condensed into a single, burning directive. He would hold this threshold until his heart stopped beating, or until the floor was slick with the blood of the men who dared to touch his wife. The first sound of the breach was a muffled thud, the magnetic lock on the service entrance being bypassed by a high-frequency pulse. Then came the soft, synchronized scuff of tactical boots on marble. They were professionals, moving in a pincer formation just as he had predicted. Seung-Jin felt a strange, jagged peace settle over him. He was the fixer, and he was about to fix the greatest mistake of his life by dying for the woman he had spent 3 years ignoring. "Stay down, Amara," he whispered into the darkness, his voice a low, guttural vibration. "Don't come out until the firing stops." He raised his weapon, his finger tightening on the trigger as the first silhouette darkened the hallway. But the shadow didn't move toward him. Instead, it collapsed with a sickening, wet crunch. A second silhouette followed, drifting toward the floor like a puppet with its strings cut. There was no gunfire, no shouted commands, only the terrifyingly efficient sound of air being forced out of lungs and the sharp snap of bone. Suddenly, the emergency lights didn't flicker on. Instead, the perimeter-led strips Amara had installed turned a deep, bruised purple. The dim ultraviolet light revealed a nightmare the Elder Council hadn't accounted for. Amara didn't stay down. She stepped out of the bedroom, not as a victim seeking cover, but as a commander inspecting her front line. She wasn't holding a gun. She was holding a tablet, her thumbs sliding across a control panel that managed the very air they breathed. Behind her, emerging from the service stairwell like wraiths born from the darkness, were 6 figures in charcoal-gray tactical gear. They moved with a clinical, terrifying synchronicity that put Seung-Jin's own former bodyguards to shame. "Who are they?" Seung-Jin hissed, his weapon still raised, his mind struggling to compute the sight of a private army occupying his home. "They are the silent partners of the Whisper Network," Amara said, her voice echoing with a devastating, melodic calm. She walked past him, her midnight black jumpsuit making her almost invisible in the purple light. She didn't look at the 3 cleanup men lying neutralized on her foyer floor. "The council thinks they own the muscle in this city because they pay the highest wages. They forgot that muscle has mothers, sisters, and daughters. They forgot that the women they ignore are the ones who cook their meals, nurse their wounds, and listen to their drunken boasts." She gestured to the lead operative, a woman with a jagged scar across her brow who bowed slightly to Amara before dragging one of the council's assassins toward the elevator. "These men don't work for the syndicate, Seung-Jin. They work for the women who are tired of losing their sons to the council's greed. They are the sons of the wives I met at the Gilded Cage. They are the private muscle that doesn't appear on any ledger." Seung-Jin lowered his gun, his heart hammering against his ribs in a rhythm he didn't recognize. It wasn't fear, it was awe. He had been prepared to be the tragic hero of a blood-soaked finale. The lone wolf standing against the pack. But Amara had bypassed the drama of the hero's death entirely. She had simply out-invested the enemy. She had built a fortress out of loyalty and shared secrets, while he had been trying to build one out of fear and silence. "The power was cut," Seung-Jin noted, his gaze sweeping over the charcoal-clad soldiers who were now efficiently securing the perimeter, their movements as silent as falling snow. "How are the lights?" "The council cut the building's main line," Amara said, stepping toward the floor-to-ceiling glass. She tapped her tablet and the glass, which he had always assumed was just reinforced crystal, began to shimmer with a digital overlay. It was a HUD, showing the heat signatures of 2 more SUVs idling 3 blocks away. "I cut the rest. I wanted them to think they had the advantage of the dark. Men like that become sloppy when they think their prey is blind." She turned back to him, her deep brown skin highlighted by the eerie violet glow. The diamond bracelet on her wrist caught the light, a single, brilliant point of defiance. "You were going to die for me, weren't you?" Seung-Jin didn't lie. He couldn't. The 3-year winter had been stripped away, leaving him raw. It was the only way I knew how to say I was sorry. Amara walked up to him, her presence warm and solid against the chilling efficiency of the room. She reached up, her hand cupping his jaw, her thumb tracing the line of his mouth. "I don't need a martyr, Seung-Jin. I need a husband who is smart enough to realize that the Ice Palace has been a war room for months. I didn't save you so you could owe me. I saved you so we could finally start the real work." Outside, the sound of distant sirens began to wail. The automated burst transmission Amara had promised was already doing its work. The cleanup crew was being cleaned up by a force they never saw coming. The glass of the penthouse, once a symbol of their isolation, now felt like the cockpit of a ship navigating a storm they were finally steering together. The shattered glass wasn't just the literal breach of their home, it was the final destruction of the barrier between them. Seung-Jin looked at the woman who had replaced his silence with a revolution and felt a terrifying, exhilarating surge of devotion. He realized that the council hadn't just failed to kill them, they had inadvertently forged the most dangerous alliance in the history of the Seoul underworld. "What now?" Seung-Jin asked, his voice finally steady, his hand moving to cover hers on his face. Amara looked out at the city, the slight amusement returning to her eyes, but this time it was shared. "Now, we go to the gilded cage. We have a $50 million checkmate to finish, and the elders are currently 5 minutes away from realizing they're bankrupt." She pulled him toward the door, her grip firm and unyielding. The fixer and the ghost stepped over the ruins of the council's pride and into the hallway, flanked by a silent, loyal army that the world didn't even know existed. The 3-year winter was dead. The nightmare had officially traveled in pairs, and as the elevator doors closed on the violet-lit penthouse, Park Seung-Jin knew that for the first time in his life, he wasn't just surviving, he was winning. The night did not end in the penthouse. It merely shifted its theater of war to the digital ether and the cold, marbled halls of the gilded cage. While the whisper networks, silent army systematically scrubbed the apartment of the council's failed ambition, Park Seung-Jin and Amara Sinclair moved through the rain-slicked streets of Seoul like a twin-headed comet. The city was unaware that its foundations were being hollowed out by a woman in a black jumpsuit, and a man whose silence had finally been weaponized into a shield. They arrived at the private lounge not as guests, but as the new owners of the silence. Seung-Jin took his position at the heavy oak doors, his imposing frame and the cold, dark promise in his eyes enough to turn away the council's remaining sentries without a single shot being fired. He was the physical wall, the fixer, reclaimed, standing guard over the perimeter of a revolution. But the real execution was happening inside the velvet-curtained booth where Amara sat, the blue light of her tablet reflecting in her steady, uncompromising eyes. "They think their wealth is a mountain," Amara whispered, her thumbs dancing across the screen with a rhythmic, lethal grace. "They think because it's hidden in the Cayman Islands and laundered through shell companies in Cyprus, it's untouchable. They forgot that every digital lock has a key, and every key is held by someone they've stepped on." Seung-Jin watched her from the shadows of the doorway, his heart swelling with a fierce, protective pride that tasted like iron. He saw the way her face set into a mask of absolute focus. She wasn't just moving numbers, she was dismantling a dynasty. With a single, final tap of her finger, she initiated the checkmate protocol she had been perfecting for 3 years. The $50 million didn't just disappear, it was redistributed. Amara watched the progress bars slide to 100% as the council's offshore reserves were drained into a series of untraceable escrow accounts. But she didn't stop at theft. She took the encrypted ledger of sins, the digital record of every bribe to the prosecution, every illegal shipping manifesto, and every sanctioned hit, and sent it flying through the airwaves to the Internal Revenue Service and the National Police Agency. In the span of 60 seconds, the Elder Council went from the untouchable gods of the Seoul underworld to the most hunted men in South Korea. Their bank accounts showed zeros. Their safe houses were being flagged on police GPS systems. Their retirement protocol had been turned inward, a digital noose tightening around their collective throats. "It's done," Amara said, her voice a low, melodic vibration that carried the weight of a final judgment. She stood up, the tablet's glow fading as she tucked it away. She walked toward Seung-Jin, her stride confident and unfazed by the chaos she had just unleashed upon the city's power structure. Seung-Jin met her halfway, his large hand finding the small of her back. He could feel the adrenaline humming through her, a mirror to his own. The Ice Palace was a memory now, burned to ash by the $50 million fire she had lit. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the ghost he had tried to protect, but the architect of his survival. "They have nothing left," Seung-Jin noted, his voice a jagged rasp of disbelief. "No money to pay their soldiers, no secrets to blackmail the ministers. You've left them naked in the middle of a storm." "I left them exactly what they gave me for 3 years, Seung-Jin," Amara replied, her slight amusement returning, though it was now edged with the cold satisfaction of a victor. "I left them with nothing but the silence. Let's see how they like the sound of it when the police come knocking." Outside, the first streaks of a gray, rain-washed dawn began to pull at the edges of the sky. The sirens were louder now, a symphony of consequences closing in on the council's high-rise estates. The elders would wake up to find their credit cards declined, their lawyers unreachable, and their empires dissolved into a series of 404 error messages. Seung-Jin pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers in the quiet of the lounge. The 3-year winter had officially broken. The checkmate was complete. He realized then that he didn't want the syndicate back. He didn't want the title of fixer for a group of dying old men. He wanted the world that Amara had just cleared the ground for, a world where they didn't have to hide from the light because they were the ones who controlled the shadows. "The nightmare travels in pairs now," he whispered, echoing the promise they had made in the dark of the penthouse. Amara smiled, a slow, radiant curve of her lips that made the luxury of the lounge look dim by comparison. "It always did, Seung-Jin. You were just too busy playing the ghost to notice who was holding the lantern." Together they walked out of the gilded cage and into the morning air. The council was broke, the police were ascending, and for the first time in his life, Park Seung-Jin felt truly free. The $50 million was just paper and pixels. The real prize was the woman walking beside him, the one who had turned his neglect into a weapon and his silence into a throne. The board was clear. The king and queen were the only ones left standing, and the city of Seoul was finally their kingdom to rebuild. The Seoul skyline at 3:00 a.m. no longer looked like a collection of jagged glass teeth. It looked like a map of a city that had been conquered and rebuilt in the dark. 6 months had passed since the night the Elder Council's retirement protocol had turned into their own digital funeral, and the penthouse of the Lot World Tower had finally stopped feeling like an ice palace. The gray marble was still there, and the reinforced glass still held back the wind, but the Cathedral of Silence had been demolished, replaced by the low, steady thrum of a shared heartbeat. Park Seung-Jin stood on the expansive balcony, the cool night air pulling at the silk of his black shirt. He wasn't hiding in a corner he never occupied anymore. He stood at the railing, his tall, imposing frame relaxed but alert, his dark eyes no longer scanning the horizon for enemies. Instead, they were fixed on the reflection in the glass behind him. Amara Sinclair stepped onto the balcony, her movement a symphony of confidence that still made the air in Seung-Jin's lungs feel thin. She wasn't wearing the red dress of a final warning tonight. She wore a deep emerald gown that flowed around her like a river of jade, her voluminous natural afro catching the moonlight like a halo of dark silver. In her hand, she held 2 glasses of vintage cognac, the same scent that had once signaled his undoing, but now served as the perfume of their victory. She handed him a glass, her fingers brushing against his with a lingering, deliberate heat. For 3 years, he had treated her like a ghost to protect her from his world. Now, he watched her every move with a total, dangerous devotion that bordered on the religious. He didn't watch her because he feared she would leave. He watched her because he finally understood that she was the gravity that kept his world from spinning into the void. "The final audit on the Busan docks came through an hour ago," Amara said, her voice a smooth, melodic vibration that carried the authority of the empire she had quietly engineered. "The last of the council's loyalists have been absorbed or erased. The Whisper Network is no longer a secret, Seung-Jin. It's the new board of directors." Seung-Jin took a slow sip of the cognac, the liquid fire grounding him. He looked down at his wife, his sharp jawline softening just a fraction. "They're calling you the architect in the streets. They say the fixer finally found something he couldn't fix, so he let his wife rebuild it instead." Amara leaned against the railing beside him, her deep brown skin glowing under the amber terrace lights. She let out a soft, amused hum, the same bluesy melody she had used to mock his silence 6 months ago. "And what do they say about you, Seung-Jin?" "They say I'm the luckiest man in Seoul," he replied, his voice a low, jagged rasp of sincerity. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her cheek, his touch no longer hesitant. "And they say that the nightmare no longer travels alone. It travels in pairs." The council was gone, their names scrubbed from the ledgers of power, and their bodies scattered to the winds of prosecution and poverty. The $50 million checkmate had been just the beginning. In the 6 months since the siege, Amara had turned the syndicate's jagged, bloody fragments into a legitimate entertainment and logistics empire. She had taken the blood money and used it to fund the very neighborhoods the elders had spent decades bleeding dry. She was the face of their new, polished legitimacy, while Seung-Jin remained the shadow, the blade that ensured no one ever dared to question her architecture. The dynamic of the Ice Palace had been inverted. He no longer ignored her existence to keep her safe. He celebrated it to keep everyone else afraid. His devotion was a warning to the rest of the world. To touch the architect was to summon the fixer, and there were no longer any protocols for mercy. "You're thinking about the hit in Tokyo," Amara noted, her gaze sharp and intuitive. She could read the tension in his shoulders before he even felt it. "I'm thinking about how much time I wasted," Seung-Jin admitted, his fingers tangling in her hair. 3 years of silence, 3 years of looking past the only thing that mattered. Amara stepped into his space, her presence commanding his total attention. She looked up at him with a calm confidence that had been forged in the crucible of his neglect. "The silence wasn't a waste, Seung-Jin. It was a workshop. If you hadn't ignored me, I might have just been a wife. Because you left me alone, I became a queen. We didn't lose 3 years. We spent them building the foundation for the next 30. She raised her glass in a silent toast to the city below, a city that was now theirs to shape. The 3:00 a.m. quiet was no longer heavy with teeth. It was pregnant with possibility. The nightmare had moved on from the Chicago underworld and the petty squabbles of old men. It had evolved into a partnership of equals, a king and queen who moved through the shadows and the light with a unified, lethal grace. Seung-Jin pulled her closer, his arm wrapping around her waist, drawing her into the warmth of his body. He watched the way the wind caught the fabric of her dress, the way she looked at the horizon with the eyes of a conqueror. He didn't need to say a word. The silence between them was no longer a void. It was a conversation, a promise, and a threat all at once. The 3:00 a.m. warning had long since passed. The crack in the door had led to the destruction of the house, but from the ruins they had built a fortress. As the first light of a new Seoul morning began to touch the tips of the towers, Park Seung-Jin finally let go of the glass of whiskey he had been holding for 3 years. He didn't need the liquid courage anymore. He had the flame. "Where to next?" he asked, his voice steady and full of a dangerous new devotion. Amara smiled, that slow, predatory curve of her lips that made his heart hammer against his ribs. She looked toward the east, toward the rising sun and the untapped markets of a world that didn't know they were coming. "Everywhere," she whispered. "The nightmare travels in pairs now, and the world was finally wide enough to hold them."